The Secret Service releases a report on how to prevent mass shootings. Plus, Bearing Arms' Cam Edwards on updates to the pistol brace ban and other ATF inconsistencies. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter right now if you want to keep up to date with the latest in what's happening with guns in America. You can also buy a membership if you want to help support the reporting that we do and get early access to this podcast, as well as exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of members-only analysis content. And you'll get the opportunity to appear on the show in a member segment if you want to. This week, we are talking about the ATF, its new pistol brace ban rule. We have a published date. We've got some controversies, a lot of stuff going on with the ATF right now. And to help us walk through all of that, we've got one of our favorite guests here on the podcast, Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms. Welcome to the show, Cam.
Hey, Stephen. How are you, sir?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I am good. I'm glad you brought me on to talk about the easy stuff. You know, the stuff that doesn't require like hours upon hours of reading legalese and government documents. This is great.
It's only the rule is only 93 pages long, and there's only another 50 pages of the impact assessment to go through as well. So right. Some light reading.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I really do appreciate you bringing me on, though. I always have a good time talking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. We love having you on. And you've written a couple of interesting things regarding the ATF lately. But I want to start real quick with the rule. We have a date for it now. They are going to publish this rule on January 31st, 2023. That gives you 120 days from that date to comply with the regulation or face potential felony charges. And so I think that's an important thing to know. We've been talking about this rule for a while because they had publicly announced the final version of it back on, I think it was January 13th. Mm-hmm. But no, they hadn't actually published the rule, and that's an important step in all this, right?
Yeah. So why do you think that there was this gap? Because typically, you'd hold a press conference maybe the day or two before. Maybe if it's going to be published on Monday, you have the press conference on Friday. But as you say, this has been like over 2 weeks now. So what do you think? What do you think was responsible for the delay?
That's actually a really good question. I think I will say that I think that they announced it, didn't publish it, but they announced the rule and put out the text of it that day because it was right before SHOT Show, which is the industry's trade show for anybody who doesn't know. So the ATF goes to SHOT Show every year to interact with the industry that it regulates. And so I think they wanted to get the text out there. Maybe they always planned to publish it on the 31st, but they wanted to get the text out so people could read it and go to them with questions during SHOT Show, which we can get into some of that stuff here because I did attend the Q&A that the ATF director put on, and we have some quotes from him that I can read out, but that's my best guess as to why there's this 2 week gap, or really almost 3 weeks gap, right? Between the announcement of the rule and the actual, technical publishing of it, because that's significant, right? Because the rule doesn't start to go into effect. There's that ticking clock of 120 days where you get this amnesty period to comply. That doesn't go into effect until it's actually published. And I think it's also significant for some of the lawsuits as well, right?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly, one of the things that we've seen post Bruin is a lot of states are kind of crafting their laws, to make it really difficult to find standing, right? You have to show that not just could you plausibly be harmed by this, but that you are actually suffering harm. And so the first lawsuit in New York filed after Bruin got rejected because the judge said, well, the law hasn't gone into effect yet, so you guys don't have standing. And then that was, refiled as Antonyuk. Ultimately, Judge Sotheby said, hey, not only do you have standing, but these laws you're likely to win. And granted that temporary injunction before the Second Circuit overturned them. So in terms of the timing, this really is important, right? Because now the clock, as you say, is ticking. And so now not just gun owners who might be plaintiffs, but FFLs who might be plaintiffs can say, okay, listen, I am going to be suffering harm because, particularly if you're an FFL right now, what do you do with the braces that you have in stock that you purchased, for retail sale because the ATF said these are fine, and now the ATF says, what do you do here? So you've basically got a very limited window for the courts to step in, or you will be irreparably harmed. You'll at least be out the cost of those braces, if nothing else, right?
Yeah. Yeah, very good point. And did you have a theory as to why there's this sort of extended delay before when they announced it and when they're going to publish it?
No, I don't have a working theory on it. I find it interesting, but I also find, your latest story at the Reload about, again, the continued clarifications of a rule that has not yet officially been published. I find that to be really interesting too. And I wonder, there's a part of me that kind of wonders if they're not just kind of floating this stuff out there, waiting for the feedback and then trying to, if need be, formally tweak the language of the rule, or simply say, oh, no, this is how we are interpreting this language. So no need to worry, gun owners. Yeah,
that could be right. I mean, that goes back to the idea of making the text available before SHOT Show so that they could actually have their officials interact with industry members to see what they said. I mean, obviously, this is the rulemaking process. They went through a whole comment period, so they should have presumably a really good idea of the objections to this rule or the problems with it. But perhaps they wanted to be sort of extra cautious. I don't know if they can even change it at this point because there's a whole like rulemaking process that you have to go through to tweak these things.
Right, and that's why to me it makes sense that they're looking for what that pushback is. And obviously, yeah, you're right. They had 200 and something thousand comments in opposition to the brace rule, right? So they know what a lot of this opposition is, but again, the language is so vague and arbitrary and ambiguous at times that I think even though it's 293 pages long, there are a lot of folks who legitimately are struggling to figure out what the ATF means with these rules and what they mean when they talk about in your case, the story that you just wrote about, pistols that are imported versus domestically produced.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit. So there was a controversy that came to light out of this rule. There's a lot of pages to this rule, so there's a lot of things in there that maybe don't come to light immediately after it's published. So I had Alex Bosco, the inventor of pistol braces, on last week on the show, and he noted that there is this issue with imported pistol braced guns because there's a federal law that deals with imported rifles that said you can't have more than 10 parts that are imported for a rifle that can't itself be imported, if that makes sense to anyone listening. Firearms regulation can be very complicated, but the point is that only applied to rifles. And so people were importing pistols of the same sort of platform as, like, say, an AK-47. I think the Draco is a common example of one of these guns that would be affected by this rule that's pretty popular. But you can import this or parts from it as a pistol variant with a pistol brace attached to it, and it doesn't violate this law. Now, the problem comes in with the ATF now considering effectively all pistol braced guns to be rifles and to be short barrel rifles at that. But the key issue here is that it's now considered rifle, and they say not only now is it considered rifle, but it always was a rifle. And so that means when you put that pistol brace on it or assembled it here in the United States, that was a crime. And the ATF talks about this in the rule. They say that removing the brace doesn't rectify that crime of assembly. And then they go on to sort of imply, at least I would say, that what you can do with those guns is only turn them in or destroy them. This is in a section where they're talking about the monetary impact of this rule. And so they have to, for the way the rulemaking process goes, they have to try and calculate what effect the rule is going to have on people who are affected by it. And so they interestingly, put everyone who owns 90, the rule is called Section 922R, and I put everyone with a gun that's affected by this into the category of people they consider who are going to be turning them in just alongside the people who can't legally own short barrel rifles in whatever state they live in, because some states don't allow you to possess them at all. And so that made someone like Alex and a lot of other people assume that they're basically forestalling this option of either removing the brace or registering the gun, which could have a pretty big impact. But ATF now says, I've reached out to them to try and get some clarity on this issue. And they say that you can, in fact, either remove the brace or register these affected guns just the same way you could with any other gun affected by this rule.
Which is fine, all things considered. I guess I'm glad as that goes for the owners of these firearms. But again, if that was the intent, then why, in this portion of the rule or the impact statement of the rule, why break out foreign produced pistols and kind of set them aside and treat them as if they're special and different than domestically produced pistols with braces on them?
Yeah. I think that's still a very good question, right? This is still, the ATF can say whatever it wants about how it's going to interpret these things. And I think it's important to get them on record, given the controversy over, how people with these guns are supposed to comply with this rule if they choose to comply with it. But, it doesn't necessarily mean that just because they put out a statement that solves all the issues in the rule itself. This was something that I talked to him briefly about it, and that was the point that he made. Like, yeah, they can say that, but it doesn't change what the rule actually says. They can put out a public statement or Q&A on their website or whatever, but it doesn't change what the rule actually says itself. And there's still, going to be questions, I think, raised in court over this exact issue.
I think you're right. And again, first of all, why should we trust any given interpretation from the ATF when they have demonstrated the ability to turn around and say, actually, never mind. We now interpret this to be completely different. And by the way, we always have interpreted it this way. There's something very Orwellian going on here, Stephen, and it goes back. Look, we saw the same thing with the unfinished frames and receivers, right?
And
when this was first put out. Yeah. With bump stocks too, but with frames and receivers specifically when it wasn't Polymer 80, but it was Division 80. Was in court suing over the new rule on unfinished frames and receivers. They said, this is going to shut down our company. And the DOJ attorney said, no, it's not, because this only applies to kits. If you're just selling an 80% unfinished, receiver or a frame by itself, you're fine. The law doesn't cover that. It's only these kits that you have to worry about. And then what was it? A month ago, 6 weeks ago?
Yep.
They come back and say, oh, actually, never mind. It's not just the kits. Now, it is actually the receivers themselves. If you got a jig, we consider that to be a kit, right? So they are constantly going back and changing their minds and telling us, okay, what we said to you 2 months ago is not what we're saying today.
Yeah.
So I think that Alex is right to be concerned about that. I think everybody is right to be concerned about this, because this is, I think, fundamentally the heart of the problem of what we're talking about here. When we talk about these administrative abuses, the ATF has the power to set regulations. They don't have the power to make law, and they don't have the power to make law while pretending that they're making existing regulations or reinterpreting existing regulations. And ultimately, I think that's what's going on here. I don't know how willful this is, but it's very easy to see this as attempts by the ATF to sort of push and prod and poke to see how far they can, what they can get away with doing here.
Yeah, and let's real quick talk about your recent story over at Bearing Arms on another example of this, where the ATF published a FAQ on its website for people who have registered NFA items, right? Things like suppressors, short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, full, machine guns. And it said that you cannot transfer the any NFA item to anyone else, even if you're in their presence. Anybody who's not the registered owner of it. And so what's the latest with that? Because I saw it and I was, it sounded very shocking because, it's you can't ever borrow, even shoot someone else's gun with a suppressor attached to it, or go to a machine gun range and rent a machine gun.
Right. That's the thing. I mean, this was, I'm quoting here from the FAQ. The question was, if I'm the registered owner of an NFA item, can someone else shoot my item in my presence? Right. So not even, hey, Steve, can I borrow your, suppressed pistol this weekend? I just want to go do some shooting. No, not even Steven, I see you shooting your suppressed pistol. Could I have a turn? According to this, FAQ, quote, no, only responsible person or persons listed on the approved registration may have physical or constructive possession of the NFA item. So, you had like Phoenix Ammunition saying not only was this shut down, class 3 rentals, but saying that, if you went to work and your, NFA item is locked up in a gun safe in your house, if your wife knows the combination of that gun safe, well, she could be considered to be in constructive possession of that prohibited item. And so unless she too is one of those registered persons, that would be a felony, right? I mean, this is just it's crazy. And again, it would be a complete change of existing law.
A huge change. I mean, there's whole businesses built around this. I mean, even, I know machine gun ranges are relatively rare things in the world. There's, Las Vegas has a bunch of them. They're around. And it's sort of the most obvious thing people might think of with this. But even like your average range generally has a suppressor, a suppressed gun that you can rent. And then, of course, the constructive possession thing is massive because of the implications of how far wide reaching that implication is. But yeah, I mean, this could have people build whole businesses around this idea that you can rent out class 3 NFA items. And it's been that way for almost 100 years since the NFA was first enacted. Right. So they just put this FAQ up and seem to change all of that overnight, at least in their public position on it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
what's
Ryan,
the latest? Is it
okay? So Ryan Petty, who is a contributing writer at Bearing Arms, Ryan's daughter was one of the victims in Parkland, and Ryan is not one who reacted with calls to ban firearms. He and his daughter love to go shooting together. He's very much still a Second Amendment supporter, but Ryan is also an FFL, so this kind of impacted him. So he reached out to ATF. I reached out to National Shooting Sports Foundation, and I think I heard back a little bit faster than Ryan did, but Ryan actually is the one who wrote this story for Bearing Arms, so I want to give him all the credit here. Larry Keene from National Shooting Sports Foundation in turn reached out to ATF, and I guess had a quicker response than we did. And this is what they told him. Quote, the Q&A currently listed on the eForms account is incorrect. In this scenario, the registered owner of the NFA weapon is co-located with the firearm and thus no transfer has occurred. However, if the person firing the NFA weapon is prohibited from possessing the firearm, then there could be a GCA violation. We are working to correct the site as quickly as possible. Larry did a little bit of additional digging on the regulations, and he found this ATF FFL newsletter from June of 2017 that specifically says the on-premise rental of national firearms is also permitted. So, again, Stephen, the question becomes, how did this get put up on the eForms website?
Right.
It was this just some IT guy freelancing and writing gun laws in his spare time? Like, I have questions about how this inaccurate information was allowed to go live and what type of editorial process there is within the ATF to put this information out there. Because once again, it seems like this is sort of designed to, I won't say designed to cause panic, but it's I don't know. It's weird to me, Stephen, how all of these mistakes and errors that the ATF makes, they all seem to cut against gun owners. It's never a mistake that really impacts the agency negatively. It's always mistakes that impact gun owners negatively. I just find that very odd.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just goes to this overall idea of the agency's inconsistency and incoherence to some degree that's really been building for the last decade or more. And it's really reaching this level now where it's difficult to take them seriously on anything they say, whether it's in a determination letter or a public statement or an FAQ on their website, or a rule that they're proposing. Like it's hard to look at it and have confidence that that either they said something wrong or they won't just change their minds in short order down the line, especially for very politically charged sort of issues, because the agency feels very politically captured at this point. They certainly seem to change their opinion on pistol braces depending on who's in the White House, and their stance towards interpreting these sort of gray area things in the NFA. They always want to push those to the boundary when there's a Democrat in the White House, and they want to do the opposite when there's a Republican, and it's extremely transparent, I think, at this point. It's difficult to continue to take the agency seriously in what they say. And that's the unfortunate thing, because they have the power to put you in prison, right? And
right.
You can't just ignore them, but it's detrimental to our society that they are this inconsistent and incoherent in how they operate, because how are gun owners supposed to act in good faith to comply with the laws that we have if the ATF is all over the place on what they're saying enforcement should be?
And, the cynical part of me says maybe that's a feature for the Biden administration and not a bug, right? Maybe the more confusing and incoherent the ATF's rulemaking is, the more likely the thinking would go that some Americans are just going to say, forget it. It's not worth the risk. I don't want to accidentally run afoul of the law, so I'm not even going to come close to violating it.
I think that is a real strategy that gets employed. I mean, look at the pistol brace rule as a whole. Let me ask you this. You're somebody who has read through this rule and covers this for a living, just like I am. And I asked Alex Bosco the same thing. He's the guy who invented these devices and owns the largest company that makes them. What are there any pistol braced firearms that are not SBRs under this rule? Do you know?
I don't know.
Me either.
But here's the thing. I think, again, that's by design, right? You're supposed to fill out this worksheet, and based on the numbers that you get and what it adds up to, that should tell you whether or not the ATF will likely consider your brace firearm to be an SBR.
Yeah, that was the old rule. They had a point system. Then people said that was too confusing, so they said, "Fine, we'll get rid of the point system." And they just don't have a system, and they sort of imply that you could maybe make one that's, in fact, so part of my story also quotes from Stephen Dettelbach, the ATF director, his speech to SHOT Show, to the industry's trade show put on by NSSF. And he implies that that you could have a braced gun that doesn't run afoul of this new rule. He talks about the standard set, like what you're talking about. They had a point system for these standards, but in the new rule, they just have these like 6 criteria, and they don't really give you any way of understanding. It includes things like the direct and indirect marketing of the device. So right. What the ATF thinks about the indirect marketing of the device, whether it implies that it's intended to be shouldered, is part of the standard. It's a wildly subjective thing. And then, whether the brace fits over your forearm, which again, people have different sized forearms. And if you notice in all the pictures in the brace, it's always like the most jacked ATF agent who's the one testing that. He's got these giant forearms.
Right.
And so, it really is impossible, I think, to know whether your gun complies with the rule. It seems to me that they're saying you can, Dettelbach says directly in one of the Q&A questions that it's possible to have a braced pistol that's not an SBR. But if you read through the rule, there's no way of telling how you would do that.
Right. And that's the thing. So they maintain that, yes, it's a possibility, which I think probably, partly at least is an attempt to provide them legal cover that, no, we're not actually making new law, right? We're not redefining every brace equipped pistol as a short barreled rifle, because it's possible that you could have one and not run afoul of this regulation. But they're not going to tell you how to do that. They're right. Again, they want you, I think, to come down on the side of,
caution.
Well, it probably is, so I better register it or I better get rid of it.
Right. I think it's hard to draw any other conclusion just looking at it objectively. I don't know, maybe we're being too unfair to the ATF. I would love to have the ATF come on and talk. I'd treat them fair. I'm sure you'd have them on your show if you could.
Absolutely.
Always welcome to address people directly, and answer some questions and try to give us more clarity. They did give some clarity on this foreign made pistol braced guns issue. So, they gave you they basically reversed themselves on the NFA possession thing. But there's so much more clarity needed, frankly. It's just not there. And actually, let me read you one quote from this Q&A that the director did. And I want to get your reaction to this as well, because this was something I didn't realize this when I was listening to it at the time, but when I went to transcribe it for this piece, I think this is going to be a significant issue as well. He talks about this is about complying with the rule and how people can comply with the rule. And he's talking to dealers. So they asked, what are we supposed to do with all the ones we have now? And he says, quote, "You can remove the brace and sell it as a pistol." And then later on, he says, that they tried to make this as fair as possible to individuals who have these devices. And he says, so there's a bunch of different options that a person has. One of those braces that is covered in configuration with a pistol, what they can do. One thing you could do is detach, and there's no longer an NFA weapon. Now you can't reattach, right? So you have to do it so you can't be reattached. So this implies that if you take the brace off of your gun, yes, it's no longer an SBR according to the ATF, but then you have to find some way of making the gun or the brace impossible to reattach in the future. Is that right? Is that what you take away from this comment?
Yeah, but also too, when you were talking about, what was it, 922R, wasn't there a statement in there that simply removing the brace does not necessarily make that pistol NFA compliant?
Well, that's the confusing part. It doesn't. So 922R is about assembling the gun. The crime is focused around assembly of the gun. And so just removing the brace, because the ATF now considers these basically all braced guns to be rifles. Right. It doesn't undo the act of assembling it. But they seem to have this position.
Just say that it did, that one of the options for these dealers would be to simply take the brace off of the gun.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why it's so confusing, right? Because it seems to be that their position, as best as I can understand it at least, is that this crime for these specific guns that were imported, of assembling them into a rifle that's not allowed. If you have 10 or more imported parts, you can't, is sort of a very niche part of the law. But now even though they were letting people import these for a decade, basically, without issue, now they're saying that this was always a crime to bring these in and then assemble them into rifles, which it just gets so confusing because people didn't consider these to be rifles when they were doing this. But the ATF is now, and the ATF clearly didn't do anything about them being rifles at the time. But that crime is separate from you not registering the gun as an SBR under this new rule. I guess
I understand.
There's two separate crimes. Removing the brace doesn't solve the 922R violation, but it does solve this issue with whether or not it's a pistol or an SBR that needs to be registered.
So then the question becomes, okay, well, what sense does that make? How does that logically make any sense? That, because one of these firearms was imported, right? We're still talking about, AK or AR variant style pistols, right?
Same
for the most
kind
part.
Of guns, basically.
But because, one was produced overseas and then brought here, that somehow it's almost like the ATF is saying that that's a functionally different firearm than a domestically produced AR style pistol that has a brace attached. This is why the rule doesn't make any sense. Well, it's one example of the rule not making any sense. And again, listen, when people talk about this rule being politically justified more so than based on public safety, I think this is a pretty clear example of that, right? I mean, what is the public safety benefit of having that rule written that way?
Yeah. And I think this comment from Dettelbach about how not only do you have to remove these braces, but you have to find some way of making it impossible to reattach them. That was news to me. I didn't remember seeing that in the rule itself. The ATF thing is, you just remove the brace and it's not a problem anymore. Or you can register it, or you can turn it in, or you can destroy it. But, obviously I think they expect the vast majority of people to just disassemble it, take the brace off. That certainly comes through in their, the impact assessment that we were talking about earlier, because they don't estimate that a lot of people are going to turn these guns in or destroy them. In fact, that was basically the only groups of people they seem to expect to do that are people who live in states where you can't have an SBR at all. So you can't register it legally. And then people who are confused about this 922R situation. No one else, it seems they were expecting to turn them in. And one of the interesting tidbits in there is why they don't expect this to happen, right? They seem to expect most people to just take off the brace or maybe just ignore the whole thing. I don't know, but
okay.
But one of the reasons they think that is because of what happened with the bump stock ban. And I want to get your thoughts on this. They say in this impact assessment that they only received 580 total bump stocks throughout the whole country out of what they estimate to be 520,000 that were in circulation when that ban went into effect. And so I think they're expecting not a lot of people to turn in these guns based off of this. Basically, nobody turned in bump stocks. And so I'm interested in your reaction to that.
I think it's wise to set their expectations low based on those numbers. But I mean, listen, you can look at New Jersey and their magazine ban, right? And the fact that 0 law enforcement agencies reported magazines being turned in. The compliance rate for the SafeX assault weapons registration requirement in New York, I think was estimated to be about 15% in the 3 years or 6 years after the law took effect in 2013. I think that there is a massive amount of noncompliance going on, particularly when it comes to these types of rules that are immediately challenged, right, in court. I think there's certainly a philosophy among many gun owners that I'm just gonna wait and see, right? Maybe I don't take these items to the range with me. Maybe I don't bring them out in public, but I'm not going to get rid of them while there's an active court challenge going on,
right?
Particularly in light of the Bruin decision. So, and
I actually think that's probably what explains the 580 that were turned in, because I know that some people turn these in with the intention of having the ATF hold on to them while these court cases were playing out, so that if they do win, which, I mean, the bump stock case did win in the Fifth Circuit just recently, as we know. They wanted to get them back at the end of that. So that's another consideration I think in here. But I mean, I also want to get your final takeaway here on on the legal situation. As I just mentioned, the bump stock ban just got blocked by the Fifth Circuit, creating a circuit split that sort of incentivizes the Supreme Court to take up that case. And it seems to me, at least, that the legal arguments are going to be identical between the bump stock ban case and any case against this pistol brace ban. Do you think I'm off base, or is that how you're looking at it too?
I mean, I've seen, I can't remember who the Second Amendment attorney was who said, it might have been Guy Relford, who talked about how there are some differences between the two rules. But I think you're right. The main thrust of the argument, and we saw this in the comments that NSSF submitted on the stabilizing brace, calling it arbitrary and capricious, right? Calling it a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act. This is, again, lawmaking, not rulemaking on the part of the ATF. And when you're taking, again, commonly owned items, somewhere between 10 and 40 million of these braces in the United States, right? That's the
Congressional Research. Congressional Research estimate. Yeah, and Alex Bosco says that Now, ATF put the number between 3 and 7, and now they're saying it's probably closer to 3. Bosco, who again is the inventor and owns the largest company that makes them, thinks it's at least 10 is where he puts it. So there's obviously, we don't know, but there's estimates all over the place. And even if it is 3 million, that's still a lot of firearms affected and a lot of owners.
It is. And again, the ATF's not arguing that these are dangerous and unusual items, right? They're arguing that putting one of these braces on a pistol turns it into a dangerous and unusual item. Now that the braces themselves are dangerous and unusual. So I think that certainly this is going to get challenged, right? We know SAF is already litigating here, and there are going to be multiple other lawsuits filed as well. I think NSSF is even looking into the possibility of litigation.
And the NRA are filing one.
Right.
As well.
So we are going to see those arguments. And I'm sure you've read the Fifth Circuit's decision on the bump stock ban. And there was kind of an interesting split in the Fifth Circuit, right? There were 13 judges who said, the ban's wrong, but they differed on the reasons. And I think there were 8 that basically said it was a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act. I think there were another 5 who said that it was the rule of lenity. That really is the overriding concern here, that this is so vague. So there are, I think, a couple of live arguments to use, and it may be that one or both of those arguments actually carry the day. I think in this case, both of these things are true. I think the ATF wrote an intentionally vague law that is really impossible for the end user to understand and therefore fully comply with. Mm-hmm. But I think that in doing so and in writing this really vague interpretation, they stretched the bounds of their own authority, and they crossed over into actually creating a new law and creating a new class of banned firearms. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see a successful challenge here. I also maybe am a little pessimistic that the Supreme Court might not step in right away, right? You talk about the split now on the bump stock ban, but the Fifth Circuit case I spoke with Michael Cargill, who's the plaintiff in that case, for Cam & Company, I think it was 2 weeks ago. And he said his case is actually a little bit further along than like Clark Opposian's and others. His case has already gone to trial. Mm-hmm. So the Supreme Court could even say like, you know what, we don't really have a mature split yet. We've got signs of a split developing, but we'll hold off for a little while.
Interesting.
That's always a possibility, and I think that the question in my mind right now is how much wiggle room, how much leeway, and how much time is the court going to give circuit courts and district courts to get this right before they once again step in and say, okay, we'll repeat it for those who are slow in the back of the classroom, shall not be infringed. Here's what we said in Heller. Here's what we said in McDonald. Here's what we said in Bruin. Pay attention and start to follow it. Yeah.
Although I will say that the Cargill case is actually not a Second Amendment case, right? It's like you mentioned earlier, it's the APA, it's the rule of lenity, which are areas where I think both of those defaults or defects occur with this pistol brace rule as well, and probably with the unfinished receivers rule too, in that like the ATF was all over the place on these things. Bump stocks they said were legal, then they decided they're not legal after the fact, and that they were also always illegal. And they did that with both of these other rules. And in fact, the pistol brace one, they've been all over the place on that in the decades since they first approved the Bosco's initial brace. And so, it's very difficult to understand if you're somebody trying to comply with the rule. Like we just went over, even the two of us don't have a perfect grasp on how it works. And so, I think it's really ripe for that kind of challenge. And while it took the bump stock ban 4 years before it actually got blocked by a circuit or by an appeals court, I think that ruling itself is going to accelerate the case against the pistol brace. That's my, I'm not a lawyer. We're not lawyers, but that's my feeling from somebody who covers this regularly is, in the Fifth Circuit at the very least, there's reason to think that this case might move much more quickly than some of the bump stock ban cases did, precisely because of that bump stock ban precedent.
I think that's a pretty good assumption. Obviously, there's no guarantee, right? It's really hard to predict what any individual court will do. But
and it doesn't mean that the Supreme Court is going to step in, as you mentioned.
No, it doesn't. But as you say, I mean, 13-3. Even again, if there was that sort of split in favor of the plaintiffs in that case as to what argument prevailed, the 13-3 I think matters, right? And that should signal that. The Fifth Circuit is at least interested in any similar abuses coming out from the ATF. So knock on wood, you're right. And this is something that's going to be on the radar sooner rather than later.
All right. Well, where can people follow along with your coverage of this if they want to learn more and read more of your writing?
Yeah, you bet. Just check out BearingArms.com. You can also go on YouTube or Rumble or all the major podcast platforms and check out Bearing Arms Cam and Company. We do that Monday through Thursday. We love having Stephen on the program. I should probably ask you off air, but can you still come on the show on a regular basis? Do we need to go through any like corporate PR stuff to make that happen?
I think I need to get approval first, but I might be able to. I'd probably still be able to do it. We'll see.
Well, you got approval last time, so it's not a big deal.
I don't think it'd be a big issue.
All right, we're going to shoot that up the chain of command, and I'd love to get Stephen on my program next week at some point. So, but yeah, we're talking with folks like Larry Keene, Michael Cargill, as I mentioned the name plaintiffs. So we try to cover one topic a day on Bearing Arms Cam and Company, and I look forward to sitting down with you again very soon.
Absolutely, me too. All right, well, we're going to head over to our news update now. All right, we're back here with contributing writer Jake Fogelman for our news update. How are you doing, Jake?
I'm doing great, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing all right. The Eagles are playing in the NFC Championship on Sunday, so pretty excited about that. We're recording this on Friday, so a couple of days of excitement building for me to go from here. By the way, another pitch here to join the Reload, because if enough of you join, maybe someday I will be able to buy tickets to the NFC Championship or perhaps the Super Bowl. You never know. But we're going to need a lot more signups, a lot more memberships for that to happen with the prices these things are going for. But so I'm looking forward to that this week. You got anything interesting coming out? Anything fun?
I'm going to
Broncos are not.
Yeah, I was going to say football is hopeless right now. Yeah. The Nuggets are doing great in the NBA. For the NBA fans out there, we're first in the West. And then actually today, as of our recording, I'm going to see DU hockey play at the Ball Arena downtown. They play against Colorado College, their crosstown rival. It's a big deal in college hockey.
College hockey, always exciting. Yeah. Flyers had 4 fights in one game last night.
Nice.
So they're terrible at hockey, but they're fun to watch when they have 3 fights.
Broad Street Bullies action.
Yeah. So they lost. To anyone wondering that question, but it was fun to watch. At least hockey's hard because I think you're not like the rebuild timeline on a hockey team is so much longer. It seems like to me than in most other sports. Maybe baseball would be another one where it's not. Football at least you're like, oh, okay. Even basketball, you get someone and they can have an impact immediately. Like Cincinnati turned their team around in like 2 years. Right, because they drafted Burrow and Chase, and then they were contenders. Obviously other things happen, but you can do something like that. Whereas, like, oh my God, hockey, like look at the Devils, the Jersey Devils. They had like 5 first-round, number 1 overall picks in a row, and they were still bad until like just now. It takes you like a decade to turn around. That's my feeling, at least, especially if your team is always sort of middling. They're right in the middle of the pack. They're never real Stanley Cup contenders, but they're also never the worst team in the league, so they don't get those kind of draft resources. Yeah. That's that's quintessential Flyers right there. Is like since 2010 when they went to the Stanley Cup, and even that run was like they got into the playoffs on a shootout in the last game. So it's not like they were super Stanley Cup favorites. They just made a great run, and then they just they've been right in the sort of middle of the pack ever since then. And I don't know, they're not going to be the worst team in the league this year either. They're probably not going to make the playoffs, but anyway, at least they're fighting. So that's something to watch. And at least the Eagles and Phillies and Sixers are good. So hard to complain too much. But yeah, Glad we got to talk a little bit about something lighter there, because now we're going to talk about something much more serious and depressing, frankly. And that's the recent mass shootings in California. We had 2 in quick succession there. And what we're going to actually focus on is a recent report from the Secret Service that you wrote about, which details some of these incidents, and it looks at a bunch of incidents over a 4-year period and tries to find some connections or some takeaways that society, we can look at and try to perhaps prevent future attacks like this. So can you just give us a little bit of detail on exactly what they found?
Sure. Yeah. So as you said, the Secret Service released this report. They have a subdivision in the agency called the National Threat Assessment Center. And they basically analyzed a series of what they call mass attacks, which they define as an incident in a public or semi-public place where 3 or more people are harmed, not including the attacker. So this is not specifically just an active shooter incident or something that you might see in other contexts. It includes things like, someone taking a car and attacking, or a mass stabbing spree, for example. So it's all of these mass attack incidents that they examined. And what they found was that, they studied 173, I guess, fell under this criteria that they used. But they found that in more than 3/4 of those cases, the individual or individuals who went on to commit these attacks exhibited concerning behavior that was picked up on by their peers, their family, or law enforcement prior to their attack.
Right.
So that tells us that there's clearly pre-attack indicators in the vast majority of these incidents.
Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of people have noticed over the years, right? The reporting on each one of these incidents, there always seems to be something that was a red flag or a warning sign. That's why red flag laws have become a relatively popular solution for this. Certainly not a perfect one for a number of reasons that we've talked about previously on the show. But there's criticism, and they don't work perfectly to prevent these incidents. But regardless, that's something that people I think have noticed, certainly from watching these unfold, is that there are usually some sort of warning sign, or usually some sort of incident that happened previously where if something had been done, it could have prevented this person from, at the very least, being able to legally purchase guns. Because wasn't that another finding of this report, that most of these guns, most of the incidents that involved guns, the guns were legally purchased, right?
Yeah. So a little less than 3/4 of these mass attack incidents were committed with firearms. And of those attacks that were committed with firearms, I believe about 1/4 involved illegally obtained guns. Mm-hmm. And about 1/3 of those attackers were prohibited in some way from owning a gun. Either they were a felon or they were adjudicated mentally deficient by a court. So in a lot of these cases, there were already things that should indicate that they couldn't obtain a gun to commit this attack in the first place.
Which does also show you that even if you do follow through sometimes and the person is prohibited, they can still carry something like this out, even by obtaining a gun somehow. I mean, sometimes it's systemic problems, like in Sutherland Springs, where the shooter was prohibited from his criminal record in the military, but those records were never shared with the FBI's background check system. So he was able to buy a gun from a dealer without being denied on the background check. But still, I think that leaves a lot of, what's 2/3 of the attackers who used a gun weren't prohibited, even though they may have had incidents in their past, which would have made them prohibited if someone had followed through on them. That sort of reminds me of, there's a lot of people, unfortunately, that reminds me of the Parkland shooter and some of his domestic violence incidents. Obviously the most recent shooter in Colorado at the nightclub, where he had previously called in a bomb threat and threatened to kill both his family members, his mother and his grandparents, and police officers, but was still not, he was charged, but the case didn't proceed because the family members dropped out, and then nothing was done about the threats towards police. So, there's a lot of those sorts of things, it seems like, from this report in a lot of these attackers' histories.
That's right. Yeah. I think they found that something like 2/3. So of that 3/4 that they identified that exhibited concerning behavior, about 2/3 of those had made serious violent threats that were picked up upon either by, employers or family members or even law enforcement in this case. I think 64% had criminal arrests or at least charges filed against them in their past. So clearly, once again, documented severe risks that weren't, I guess, not enough was done to intervene to prevent them from later going on to commit more heinous acts.
Yeah. And you saw this in the Monterey shooting with that attacker. He had at the very least, a previous criminal incident with illegal possession of a firearm in the 90s. And so it's not clear why that didn't make him prohibited, why he was able to purchase guns or have the guns that he used. But yeah, so this carries through even to these most recent shootings. And I think it's important to understand that because as I think this report gets into, it means that things can be done,
right.
that these are preventable, many of these incidents. So can you talk a little bit about that section? Like, so they're saying, all right, there's these red flags that occur. There's some common ones among these attackers that we examined. What do they say about what could be done?
Yeah, so I guess they have a system. Behavioral threat assessment is the Secret Service's term for their system for trying to identify these patterns of behavior and then work with either local law enforcement partners to sort of implement plans at the department level. But it also recommends stuff like workplaces creating threat identification programs for, or other cases, sort of like intermediary, getting between workplace grievances and identifying workplace grievances before they fester and become violent, because the vast majority of these attacks, they were saying, could be identified to a personal grievance of some sort, either perceived or a real slight that was done to one of these attackers. And so being better about at the community level, at the workplace level, at the school level, creating these systems to intervene before things fester and become violent when they don't need to be is what they're really recommending.
Yeah, and I think that goes along with something that Professor James Allen Fox from Northeastern, who helps run the Associated Press's mass shooting database, what he was telling me back when we had him on the podcast a while ago, I think it was, over a year ago now, but a lot of these basic lessons remain the same, unfortunately, each time, which, is that these are preventable. These are people who generally feel some sort of grievance that they've been, wronged in some way, and that they don't see that they see this as a outlet for that, and that there can be ways to intervene ahead of time if you recognize the warning signs and take action. Now, at the same time, this report also makes clear that there isn't necessarily a mass shooter profile. It's not like you can just check off, he's got these three characteristics, so this person is definitely going to be a mass shooter. They do note, I think repeatedly in there, that while these warning signs can indicate that someone is, prone to commit a mass attack like this, doesn't mean that they will. And in fact, the vast majority of people who exhibit one of these warning signs will not become violent, right?
Yeah, they especially made this clear when it comes to mental health symptoms, because I believe they identified something like 60+% of these mass attackers exhibited one or more mental health symptoms leading up to their attacks or during their attacks. But of course, we know that people all over the place struggle with mental health illnesses to one extent or another, but then don't go on to commit attacks, right?
Of course not.
So you have to be careful with how you apply these perceived criteria, because like you said, not everyone that meets some of these criteria is going to go on to then become an attacker.
Right. It's just like not everyone who has a grievance at work or feels bullied or is upset about their divorce or something along those lines is going to go out and kill somebody. That's obviously not the case. I think that is something that makes it more difficult, right, to combat these things, because you can't know ahead of time which person who exhibits one of these warning signs that they describe in this report is going to end up being somebody who is capable of committing this kind of mass violence, because the vast majority of people are not somebody like that, or even if they are, even if you could prove somebody was predisposed, it doesn't mean that they would do it, right? That's the issue that you're dealing with, and so I think but still, it doesn't mean nothing can be done again, right? Still, they have these solutions that they've laid out of basically making sure that you're intervening when you see one of these warning signs, whether it's a school official, a work, somebody who works with someone else who's exhibiting this kind of stressor, or a family member. Like, you have to realize that first of all, people who carry out mass shootings don't always, there's no profile for someone like that. It's, there's a stereotype out there about it, and excuse me, but that can lead to people assuming that, well, this person might be struggling with something, but they're not, the stereotype of a killer. And so I'm gonna, not do as much as maybe I should. I'm not going to be the person who speaks up or intervenes to get this person help, or to, make sure that they're held accountable for their actions or something like that. When they commit a smaller level crime, and I think that is ultimately one of the big problems that they're talking about in this report. Is there's people recognize these warning signs, but they often don't associate them with the potential risk of, them leading to a mass attack, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It's a matter of identifying these patterns of behaviors that have been pre-attack indicators in the past, especially if they occur, multiples of them occur for a single person, and then basically a communal-based see something, say something type response where, get involved, don't be afraid to intervene, because it just might prevent something like this from happening in the future. Right.
Yeah, that is, I think, the takeaway that I got from that report too. And I think it's valuable. I think there's a lot of experts who study this that basically point to the same answer, which is what this report also gave us, which is there are warning signs. They don't necessarily mean that whoever's exhibiting these warning signs is going to commit mass violence, but they should be followed up on regardless, right? Whether it's, and that can be different kinds of way, whether it's getting someone mental health resources, or whether it's making sure they're held accountable when they commit a lower level crime, whatever the case might be. There are different solutions, but there are these common warning signs that exist in these situations that are perhaps easier to see in hindsight, but something people should look for ahead of time and recognize. And you see that advice in this report. You see it in the Violence Project's writings, which is another good resource on this, whose data actually encompasses an even wider range of time, goes all the way back to the 50s, I believe. And then, James Allen Fox will often also, advocate for the same thing in terms of recognizing warning signs and doing something about it. So, I think that's a really important thing to recognize across these different experts who are focused on this issue especially the ones that focus on it in a nonpartisan way, that sort of aren't attached to one side of the gun issue or the other, like this Secret Service report. There's things to criticize in here, certainly. I'm sure, for instance, their methodology is, it's actually a bit confusing. They seem to be, there's 3 or more injured in a public attack. But I don't know what criteria, because obviously they only got 173, whereas the Gun Violence Archive has several hundred every year. So I don't know if they're rooting out like gang-related incidents or crime-related incidents that aren't sort of random acts of violence, like what most people think of with mass shootings or mass attacks. But Obviously that's way more than what you have from, the Violence Project or the AP's count. It's way less than what you have from the Gun Violence Archive count or from, for instance, the FBI's active shooter estimates are much higher as well. So there's always going to be, there really isn't a gold standard at this moment for how to measure these things, or at least I think there's a gold standard, which is like the Violence Project's 4 more killed in a public shooting that's not gang related. But that's what I think most people associate with mass shooting, although it can be very useful to broaden that out for this kind of research, especially if you're looking for people who are carrying out attacks, but maybe they're not as successful at it. You should still look at that incident and understand it. Now, I do think rooting out the gang violence or other sorts of crimes like, robbery gone wrong sort of situation is very different from a random act of mass violence, in my opinion on that. So there are some better measures in my mind than others. And obviously we've talked about this a bunch on the show before, but there's definitely things in this report that you can criticize, but it's another one where I see a lot of the same conclusions that I see from other serious researchers on this topic. And so I think it's valuable.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. When researcher after researcher that, as you said, focuses narrowly on this issue, comes up with similar conclusions that, hey, we keep identifying these same few red flags, these same few pre-attack indicators. That's definitely something to keep an eye on. And I think folks should take it pretty seriously. So,
absolutely. And this is part of what we cover, right? I mean, it's not the main focus of our coverage, but it's an important part of this whole discussion of guns in America. So we will keep on top of it for sure. And if you want to stay on top of it as well, I would encourage you to go over to thereload.com and buy a membership today. You'll get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and additional reporting that you can't find anywhere else. You'll also get this podcast a day early, and you'll get the opportunity to appear on the show. I'm hoping we can have another member segment here in the near future. So if you're a member and you want to be on, just reach out in your Sunday newsletter, which is another perk of membership. You get an extra newsletter each week. But we'd love to have more of you guys on. Always enjoy talking to the members. I saw a bunch of them at SHOT Show. So that was fun to see people in person as well. But we'd love to have you on the show and chat with you a little bit about just everything, your life and how you got interested, how you became a member, all that stuff. So reach out, just reply to your Sunday newsletter and I'll get that email. But for now, that's all we've got. And we will see you guys again next week.